Okay, well, most people seem to have joined. Welcome to the latest IA webinar with me, Syed Kamall. I'm a professor of politics and international relations at St Mary's University in Twickenham, and I'm also the academic research director here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And this evening, I'm joined by a panel with a range of views to discuss the future of UK-China relations post-COVID. And if you think about it, the Chinese government's hesitation to share details about the outbreak of COVID has clearly raised concerns about trust, but it's also reignited existing concerns over the Chinese government's suppression of internal dissent, human rights abuses, its aggressive foreign policy, its blind eye to violations of intellectual property rights, cyber attacks, technology espionage, and currency manipulation. Some argue that we're in a new Cold War with the Chinese Communist Party seeking to take over where the Soviet Union communism failed. Others believe that this betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of the Chinese Communist Party and its China First policy, in which it seeks access to markets, resources, and technology while making sure it is not dominated in its own neighbourhood, given its long memories over the actions of the British and the Japanese. Now, to discuss these perspectives, I'm delighted to be joined by a panel with a range of views. But before I introduce the panel, let me just talk you through the format for this evening. This event is being recorded and it's currently being live streamed also on our YouTube channel, IA London, where a recording will be available at a later date. What we'll do is we will start with 5 minutes each from each of our panelists. I've asked them to be rather self-disciplined tonight. And then after they've all spoken and given their opening remarks, I will then turn to Q&A. If you're on Zoom, please feel to submit questions during their talk. Don't feel that you have to wait for the Q&A session. If you prefer to remain anonymous, you can do so. You can select this option in the Q&A function. Please do not use the chat function for questions and answers. Please use this to share relevant links or to report a technical problem. And our team here at the IA will be sharing relevant links, such as links to reports on China and other relevant material. What I'm also going to do is I'm not going to ask you I'm not going to unmute you to ask the question. I will ask your question on your behalf. So please write your question in full in the Q&A function. If we have more questions than time allows, what I'm going to do is ask you to go to the Q&A function, even if you haven't asked a question, and to vote on the questions. So in a very democratic sort of Premier League sort of way, I will select the questions at the top of the table. Now, of course, that changes all the time, but that's probably the fairest way to do it. So let me introduce our panel. Sir Iain Duncan Smith was a signatory to a letter calling for a tougher stance on China, as well as a leading figure in the rebellion that forced Downing Street to adopt stricter controls on Huawei. He's recently called for Chinese ownership of British businesses to be subject to a national security review by the British government in order to assess the impact of Beijing's growing economic power. He's a co-chair of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, an international cross-party group of legislators from 18 countries working towards reform on how democratic countries approach China. Dr. Steve Davies is at education here at the IA. He's an academic historian, and he co-authored a recent IA paper, Chinese Puzzle, a classical liberal approach to post-pandemic relations with China. For full disclosure, I should say that the other co-author was myself. Damien Green was one of the senior conservatives that signed a letter calling on the government to adopt a tougher stance towards China. He's also a member of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, but he's also one of the founders of the China Research Group, which is a group of conservative MPs set up to promote debate and fresh thinking in the UK about how Britain should respond to the rise of China. Here at the UK, one of our Nobel laureate fellows, Ronald Coase, co-authored a paper a few years ago, How China Became Capitalist, and he was rather optimistic about the outlook. Tonight, we're joined by Mark Littlewood, the current Director General of the IA, who I suspect is a little less optimistic, and he will respond to each of the comments. As I said, I'm going to ask each panelist to speak for 5 minutes each. I've asked them to keep the time for themselves on their phone or their watch in order to avoid me coughing loudly. After that, we will then have a short free-flowing discussion. Please feel free to submit your questions. With all that in mind, let's start the discussion, and I'll turn to Iain for his opening remarks. Iain, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'll hand the floor over to you. Could we unmute Iain? Sorry. Thank you.
Very good. I was going to say that if you start coughing too much, of course, I shall assume you have COVID, in which case I shall shut you down immediately and self-isolate you and carry on talking. But anyway, moving on from that, thanks very much indeed for inviting me. I think this is a really important subject. I just want to start off by saying China does pose a massive problem for the nature of the free world, the liberal economies that assume automatically, as George Osborne did back at the time of what then became known in the government through the civil service as Project Kowtow, when in actual fact his comment, I remember arguing with him about this, was that don't worry, because in fact opening up Chinese markets will of course lead to a significant liberalization of their government and type of government and the way in which they operate with the rest of the world. I think the truth is we've seen almost exactly the opposite take place. And that's because I think we've misunderstood the nature of where China sees the rest of the world and itself in a completely different term. I mean, the key problem here is that China does not see its form of government as anything else but the right form of government. The Chinese Communist Party believes that the rest of the free world has got it badly wrong, and that the way to run an economy and a government and their type of system is through centralized and then disseminated control down at the very every level. And in fact, since those early days when we were doing with it, the President Xi has made it very clear that he has tightened up that control rather than loosened it, as the economy in China has grown significantly, and Western economies have level best to pour as much money into China to produce products cheaper, but to buy into technologies and to share technologies. And this is the challenge that we face. The truth is, the government of China is exactly what it says it is, a totalitarian dictatorial regime that brooks no dissent at any stage and moves quickly to crush that dissent. We can see that throughout the whole of the way that China behaves internally. The Uyghurs are a big story at the moment. Huge issues around whether or not what they're doing is genocide. Tibet is getting worse in the sense that 500,000 are now being moved into labor camps. But beyond that, you've got the treatment of the Christians, the Falun Gong, and now I understand Inner Mongolia, those living there are having their languages banned, and it's the start of the way that they moved on the Uyghurs as well. So there's a pattern of behavior which is don't let separate ethnic groups create division and divide you, and you have to do whatever it is to silence those and to dispense with that. And then externally, you know, China has accelerated its plans. The South China Seas is a fascinating land grab or sea grab, as it were. They had no historic links with that. The UN told them that, but they've still stayed there and they've built up these islands. They're a huge problem for places like Vietnam and the Philippines. Obviously, it's a resource-rich area. And then you deal with their behavior to their neighbors in India on the border. And now, of course, they're finally abandoning of what they thought was the persuader for Taiwan to come on board with the one country, two systems in Hong Kong. Exasperation, finally, with Hong Kong and its concept of free speech has allowed them to trash the Sino-British agreement and install their own Chinese security system in Hong Kong. And many of those people that I have spoken to, many of them now under arrest and being shipped into China for what can be said to be less than a proper and fair trade. But beyond that, how do they behave in their market relationships with different countries? There's no question in my mind that what President Xi said early on, that he intends to be the dominant economic power by 2049 and the correspondingly dominant military power, is absolutely clearly what he wants to do. And they are well on track to do that. They break the rules wherever they feel like it in terms of the trading rules. And they also set out strategically and have managed successfully to corner key areas that they know the free world needs. Let's just look at rare earth materials. They have cornered now about 80 to 85% of the world's production of rare earth materials. These go into the computers, the batteries, technology. They also have the world's largest production capability of bringing rare earth materials down to the level that they can be used, with the rest of the world charging over there to get these. Batteries, of course, are critical for this, and they also have the world's largest battery production process. You can see the local authorities in the UK now charging over there to stick into their buses all those Chinese batteries. The Belt and Road project is nothing short of extension of power through control economically, and the countries, particularly in the developed world, they have lined up to use their money, but their money comes with a strong set of strings attached, which is you get the loan, but you have to buy Chinese, so you buy it back. And anyway, in the UN, of course, the more of these countries that come onto Belt and Road, the fewer there are likely ever to vote against them in the UN when it comes to anything to do with their practices. So this is a strategic plan the sort of plan that only really you could argue that a communist dictatorial regime can actually make. It has tied in two things really importantly, and here I will end. It has tied in the desperate need for the West to seek markets and to invest their money and to use their money to build those markets. So it knows that that money will flow to China almost regardless of how they behave. And the second thing is, instead of just taking that money and using it in any way, they use it strategically to build themselves that middle kingdom back to where they believe they should have always been, bar the last 250 years. So this is the problem we face. We are dealing with a country, not like any other country, small enough and manageable. This country is a dominant and growingly more dominant in the world, not just economically, but militarily. And the West needs to figure out that having fed this, when does it stop feeding it? And when does it start beginning to believe that this is detrimental to world trade and to diplomacy and peace?
Well, Iain, thank you very much. And thanks very much for your discipline on timing. I suspect that comes partly from your military training. Let me now move on to our next speaker, Steve Davies, who co-authored the paper Chinese Puzzle, A Classical Liberal Approach to China Post-COVID. Steve, if you unmute yourself and join, we would love to hear your views.
All right, thanks, Syed. Well, I don't disagree with the facts that Iain just set out because they're indubitable, it seems to me, most of them anyway. What I would disagree with is the kind of theoretical model or prism that he's using to interpret some of that. Now, it's very clear, I think, that the policy that Western countries have followed towards China, which he described in his reported conversation with George Osborne, was mistaken. And I think it was driven by a kind of naive economism, which that remark by George Osborne, I thought, summed up perfectly, which is the idea that if you can only have a capitalist economy and an open market economy, it's logically and necessarily going to lead to a kind of liberal society and a democratic political system. It's a kind of inverted Marxism, basically, in which you get the kind of same idea that the material structure of production is going to determine everything else. This is clearly false. It's also undoubtedly true that the Chinese regime is extremely unpleasant. It's got a huge long list of human rights violations, which has been getting steadily worse, as Iain rightly said, and which is very bad news for people who happen to be under its control or close by. I should imagine the Vietnamese, for example, who've got a history of bad relations with China going back 1,200 years, are not feeling very happy right now. But the question is, what is actually going on here? What is the nature of the regime we're dealing with here? And what is the nature of any conflict of interest that the British state, the British and the West more generally may have with this state? And it's true, of course, that nominally the People's Republic is a communist state. But what I think we need to realize is that the model of the Cold War, the way we reacted to the Soviet Union, is not the appropriate one here, because the Chinese government, I think, certainly wants China to become much more powerful. It wants it to become the Middle Kingdom again, if you will. But what it's not interested in is evangelistically spreading a particular ideology. I'm quite sure that Xi Jinping does think that his system of government is much better and that ours is degenerate and useless. But there's no sign in the policy of the Chinese state that it wants to actually impose its system of government on other people. Now, the way I would interpret China's policies and the kind of state and regime that it is, and particularly its commercial policies, is that it's actually a classic mercantilist state. It's a kind of authoritarian mercantilist state of the kind that, Adam Smith was arguing against, that we had in Europe during the colonial era. And that's what goes along with things like the Belt and Road Initiative and the policies it's following towards Africa and other parts of Central Asia. It's all about trying to capture raw material supplies. So it's not an aggressive ideological force like the Soviet Union was. It's something much more like, I don't know if you want to be really sort of drawing analogies to it, something like maybe Imperial Germany or even Ancien Regime France. Now, the question then is twofold. One is, what conflicts of interest do we actually have? We actually obviously have an ideological conflict of interest in the sense that we have a very different idea about what is the proper way for governments to behave and for society to be organized. In terms of realpolitik, because I think what we're talking about here is conventional great power relations within the international system, I don't think that Britain has that much conflict, except perhaps in certain specific areas like Hong Kong and maybe in East Asia, to the extent that we have interest there. And I think what we need is a very kind of hard-headed Bismarckian approach at the level of foreign policy. And then the other thing is, what should we do? Now, I think it would be a big mistake to simply try to completely cut off relations with China. Certainly, there are some things the government should do. You don't want a state like that, for example, controlling key or strategically important industries and companies. But on the other hand, I do think it would be a mistake to cut off links completely. And finally, all of the focus in much of this discussion is on what governments should do and what government policy should be. And I think we should think far more about what civil society can do and how civil society in Britain should relate to civil society in China, which does exist, albeit under the thumb of the party, and of ways in which contacts can be made and links can be established, which will actually support the many people in China who have no love for Xi Jinping and the Communist Party and would dearly like to get out from under their control. This is going to piss off the leadership of the party massively, of course, but then I think I would agree with Iain that we can be relaxed about that.
I'm sorry, I've lost the audio. I'm going to see if my team here can get it back. I don't know. Can someone put their thumbs up if they can hear me? Great, thank you. Damián, I'm gonna come to you next, and you've got a slightly different angle coming from the China Research Group. So could I ask you to take the floor, and I'll see if someone here can help me with my audio. Thank you.
Sure. And apologies, I'm having some technical issues as well, but I hope you can hear me. And I'm slightly worried that there'd be a danger of a violent agreement between me and Iain, but happily, although we agree on this, we have a slightly different approach here. I mean, it seems to me the basic background is that we've come to the end of what was a hopeful period of policy. You know, Nixon to China, Henry Kissinger's great achievement, all of that was a good idealistic thing for the West to do from the 70s onwards. And basically, it's now failed and we've got to move on. What we've learnt over the intervening decades is that China will not play by any kind of international rules. I thought it was interesting that you, Syed, at the start had a list of issues where the Chinese state and country was behaving appallingly aggressively around the world. Iain also went through a list of them, which didn't overlap completely. It's not like there's 3 or 4 problems we all know about, like the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, whatever. We can all pick and choose a large number of issues, any one of which would make China a problem state. You know, their attitude to Taiwan, the wolf warrior diplomacy around the world, what they're seeking to do with the internet, as well as their complete decision to ignore any kind of decent behavior on intellectual property theft and so on. So there are all this list of issues which clearly form a pattern of aggression. And I think fairly bleakly, from a Chinese point of view, we have to admit that it's working. If you're Xi Jinping at the moment, you think this is all going okay. We look at the fact that, all right, they may be fiddling the figures, but by and large, they have handled COVID reasonably well. Their post-COVID economy seems to be going better than many of the Western economies. The Belt and Road system, which Iain referred to, is working. You know, large parts of Africa are coming under Chinese control, and unlike the European powers in the 19th century, they're not having to fight wars to do this. They are, you know, controlling effectively the economies and perhaps more importantly the raw materials of a large part of the world without any particular military effort at all. And so all of this would impel one to say we ought to be much tougher and much more aggressive, and yet of course we want the trade and economic ties. And you know, that is the great constraint on Britain and other Western countries. And that's the lesson of Huawei. It's why the British government was so slow in recognizing the threat of Huawei, because we'd gone through this period of the golden era of relations under David Cameron and George Osborne, and are very reluctant to give that up. It's perfectly clear that that era is now over, but what next? And in that context, addressing the question of what should we be doing as the UK, I do think the Cold War is the best analogy to use, not least because it does strike me, looking around the British establishment in particular, that there are, as there were for the Soviet Union in its early days, a large number of useful idiots around the place who are prepared to play the role of boosting Chinese power in ways that are frankly not in the long-term interest of this country. But what I would say in terms of a Cold War is that we should move straight to the détente phase. We shouldn't have the 25 years we had leading up to that, because we are already intertwined economically. So what we need to do now is say, we want your trade, we want economic ties, but we are only prepared to do that under certain rules. So we accept that we're adversaries, but we don't want to destroy each other. And what do we require to do that? The first is much better international democratic solidarity than we've had up to now. And it does seem to me this could be a significant and game-changing role for post-Brexit global Britain. Actually, we're in a quite good position to try and assemble a new coalition of what we used to call the West, but absolutely must include India and Taiwan and other countries, Australia, places like that. And secondly, we need to take a tough-minded attitude to international institutions. We should try and resist the Chinese taking over various international institutions. But also, it seems to me, in the long term, it's better to bind the Chinese into those international institutions, because over time that will chip away at their behaviour. And at the same time, we need to push back in specific areas, like their attempts to take over the internet. We've got to be absolutely hardline about that. One hopeful thought is that this is one of the few things that in Western countries cuts across ideological boundaries. Iain's very good initiative with IPAC has got politicians of both left and right in many countries signed up to it. So this is something that actually unifies our democracies when so much divides it. And I suppose the final question is, what does success look like? Success looks like China behaving like everyone else. Not like everyone else in it will be a superpower along with the United States. But just as most of the time, the United States, broadly speaking, obeys international rules, promotes its own interests with ferocious aggression, but does it within a set of rules. If China did that, then we would all be in a better position. The world would be in a happier place. And I think in the long run, that would be better for the Chinese people as well.
Well, thank you very much, Damián. That reminds me, one of your comments reminds me that I chaired a similar discussion on this very topic at the St Mary's University, where I teach politics and international relations. And one of our guests was Will Hutton, who obviously is not no obvious friend of the Conservative Party, but he clearly also had concerns over China and actually praised some of the thinking on the right over China. Now, let's turn to Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the IA. Ronald Coase wrote that book, I think, in 2012, where he's quite optimistic about China. Probably like many people, that optimism has faded. Mark, you've heard all the views tonight. What are your reflections on this debate?
Yes, I'm afraid, Syed, I have become more concerned and pessimistic. I don't know if it's just a sign of getting older. About 20 years ago, I was optimistic and enthusiastic about the EU. The more I saw of it, the more pessimistic and sceptical I got. About 10 years ago, I was quite optimistic about China. The more I've seen of it, the more pessimistic and concerned I've got. And both Iain and Steve hit on the point that the extraordinarily simplistic view that economic liberalisation would inevitably lead to political and social liberalisation has, to put it marginally, been found wanting. So I agree with Steve's point that China doesn't represent the same sort of existential threat as the Soviet Union. There is not any obvious tendency to wish to impose a particular ideology or hegemony across the entirety of planet Earth. So there are differences, although the response might be relatively similar. And the numbers are pretty shocking. I want to address some of my comments to Damian's point about an international coalition, and particularly whether that could come together over the course of a response to what's happened on COVID. But I think Iain said by 2049 they will be clearly a superpower, or that's their aim. I mean, I think it's going to be considerably more rapid than that. I think that it's almost certain that by 2030 they will have the largest GDP on the planet. I think there's no doubt about that really now. And growth remains extraordinarily impressive. I mean, you might say that that shows that they have handled the pandemic well domestically, but they certainly haven't handled it well internationally. And I'd be interested to, so actually just on the growth figures, China's economy now, these are forecasts, I grant you, set to grow 2% this year. World GDP likely to shrink by about 4.5%, US by about 5%, Eurozone by about 8%, UK by about 10%. I mean, don't treat those numbers as gospel. So say by any metric, China on course to be the world's largest economy by 2030. I think it was only a fortnight ago the aggregate of their main stock markets reached a record high. But I wanted to sort of take up Damian's challenge on the sort of an international democratic coalition, because I strongly agree that that needs to be formed, but I'm interested in how it would be formed and what it might say. And I'm afraid I'm extremely hawkish on what the international response should be with regard to the impact that COVID has had, which, although the jury is not in, I place the blame fairly and squarely at the door of the Chinese Communist Party, that they, because truth to power, it seems on the face of it as a prima facie case, I accept that more investigation will be needed. But because truth to power could not be spoken in China, this has become a colossal international health and economic incident, which we can rightly blame the Chinese Communist Party for. The IMF estimates that by 2025, world GDP would have been reduced by about 28 trillion US dollars. So it's about $3,500 US dollars per person. In the normal course of events, and I'm not saying that we would get very far by pursuing this, we would be looking for compensation from the Chinese. I think in many ways this was China's Chernobyl, although at least the Soviet Union with regard to Chernobyl, Gorbachev acted late but decisively when he did. The Chinese Communist Party failed to do that. And I'm surprised more in the West are not at least raising morally, if not within realpolitik, the issue of reparations to China. And I'm afraid to say where I'm pessimistic, despite the noble efforts of Damien, Iain, and various others who've taken an interest in this topic, is there seems to be very, very little sign of the West taking anything approaching a hard line. And Damian's right, the West needs to be an enlarged definition, not just the sort of NATO powers. The only person who seems to have taken a hard line is President Trump, and his hard line seems to be rather bombastic and at least as much about political theatre as about serious geopolitical strategy. It has been found wanting everywhere else. I'm astonished that there has not been more pushback from democratic Western governments about the extraordinary behaviour of the World Health Organization that I think has been not far off a puppet of the Chinese Communist Party when it's come to COVID, certainly not an international institution that has emerged from the last 6 months with a great deal of credit to its name. But with the singular exception of the United States of America, the funding continues unabated, and I think with virtually no strings attached. So I'm concerned about the growth of China, not in the same way as a young man that I was concerned about the growth of the Soviet Union. I don't think it poses the same threat. But economically, it is colossally successful. The Soviet Union wasn't. We could probably, at least in retrospect, have been confident that the USSR was going to go bust. That clearly does not apply to the Chinese situation. I would like to see a more disciplined, hardline approach by the Western alliance, but I see, I'm afraid, virtually no sign of that emerging, other than through the occasional rantings of the current president, who, of course, may be ousted as early as next week. So much to worry about. I'm glad that politicians like Damien and Iain are turning their attention to it. But so far, the response by the West and democratic leaders has been parlous, I'm afraid.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, and thank you very much to all the speakers. We've got just under half an hour. I've just put a couple of posts that I've put into the chat function. We've posted a link to the IA paper, Chinese Puzzle, a classical liberal approach to post-pandemic relations with China. Also, we've posted a link to the Ronald Coase paper from 2012. I'm going to post a link to the China Research Group website for Damien. If there's anything else, Iain, that you want to post, please feel free to post that in the chat function as well. We've got so far 15 questions. Now, some of those questions, some people have asked more than one question. So if you've done that, I will ask your top question as voted by the others. We're clearly not going to get through all those questions. What I'm going to ask you to do at home or wherever you're watching from is to go into the Q&A function and to vote for vote for those questions you think deserve to be asked or merit to be asked, and I will ask. That will help push those ones up the league table. I'm also not going to put questions to all four panelists. I'm going to choose, unless one of the panelists feel very strongly that they should answer, I'm going to ask. I'm going to put it to say two panelists at a time. So let me start with the first one. It's from an anonymous attendee. As we said, they obviously don't want the Chinese to know who they are. Let's start. And the question is: Western elites have spent the last 2 decades justifying their engagement in friendship with China on the basis that China would become more like the West as it matured. Now, following such policies has demonstrably failed. Not only has there been no abatement of the threat from China, but it has got considerably worse. Why, therefore, should we listen to arguments for engagement and internationalism now? That reminds me very much in my course where I teach international relations of sort of liberal engagement, liberal institutionalism, and now should we become more realist? Steve, this question seems to be aimed at you, but others can come in. So why don't you take that question? Okay, can you unmute, Steve? Sorry.
Unmute myself, yes.
Yeah.
The thing is this: there's more than one kind of international engagement. Now, I think that, as Damien rightly said, what was going on previously was an attempt to tie the Chinese state into basically the international system that we've had since 1944 and Bretton Woods. And at the same time also to tie it into a global economic system with the hope that this would transform their social and political system. Clearly that did not work. And clearly also that system that was created in 1944 is beginning to fall apart, and not just because of China. I mean, it's falling apart mainly, I think, because of the increasing problems of its dominant force, the United States. Now, the question is, therefore, does that mean that, therefore, you should cut China off and go for containment, as it was called in the early stages of the Cold War, or even confrontation? I don't think so. But the point is, what you want is a different kind of engagement. You need to have not just a more robust ideological response, which, as Mark said, there hasn't been so far. You also need engagement not just by governments, but also by civil society actors of one kind or another. There are dissidents in China, very brave people, just as there were dissidents in the former Soviet Union. And what we should be thinking about doing at a civil society level is helping people like that. And there's also room for other things like waging an ideological competition, if you will, with the Chinese government and its leadership.
You're mute, Syed. Syed, you're muted.
I apologize. Thank you very much, Steve. I'm not sure whether any of the other panelists want to come in on this. Iain, please come in.
Just very briefly, two things. One is the comparison with Russia or the Soviet Union as it became, I accept isn't the same. The difference has been China worked on the same principles of applied communism across their industry and their economy, but learned quickly the lesson that it doesn't work. And what they realized, I think, and this is what made them, I think, more dangerous in a sense than the Soviet Union, the West is beating a path to their door to invest their money and to support them. Nobody ever did that with the Soviet Union. And the reason is because they're offering something to the West which is tailored directly to their instincts. They have spotted the significant weakness of the free world, which is money comes first. And once you lodge money and the economy, all the rest of politics dovetails in behind it. Very clever. It's exactly what the case is. As a result of that, they have grown in serious power whereas the Soviet Union was a sham power in the sense its economy was a disaster and it collapsed because of that. We don't see that with China, and that's what makes them, I think, a greater threat, because they're set, I do believe, on dominance, dominance in the markets and the mechanisms of the markets, and they've already well established a lot of that. That's the key problem.
Well, thank you very much for that, Iain. Let's just remind everyone, I've also put in the chat function, I've put a link to the China Research Group. I'm going to put a link to the International Parliamentary Alliance on China later on in the chat function. If you have asked your question in the chat function, could I ask that you actually use the Q&A function for your question? And please, if you haven't done so already, please go to the Q&A and vote on the other questions, because we're clearly not going to get through all 19 questions in the next 20 minutes or so. Next question, and I'm going to start with Damien and then Mark on this. Richard Parsonson says, is the West better off with Trump or Biden in dealing with China? Damien.
I, for all sorts of reasons, I would vote for Biden if I had a vote. But I think I take Mark's point that Trump has been rhetorically the only Western leader who's actually taken China head on. But the problem is he does it on Monday and Tuesday, and then on Wednesday and Thursday he signs a great trade deal with them, and then on Saturday he reneges on that. So I think the Chinese have decided that they can do business with Trump. It's just like the rest of the world; they don't know what he's going to do from one day to the next. So I mean, in a sense, I think, in a weird way, in this narrow instance, it doesn't matter that much. But what really matters, and this picks up on the previous point about the comparisons between Russia and China as an adversary of the West, what really matters is that America is strong and attractive. And that means it needs economic strength in a way that clearly it hasn't had too much in recent decades. But also to be a society evidently at ease with itself. If you want to say to people, our way of life, broadly speaking, our democratic way of life is better than the Chinese way of life, then it's a tough argument to make when you're looking at what's happening on the streets of America at the moment, which is what the world will be looking at. So if you like to strengthen my view of Biden rather than Trump, I think there is more chance of America as a society healing under Biden than it ever will under Trump. But that's the basic thing that the West has got to do, apart from re-establishing economic growth, is to make it apparent that the citizens of democratic societies are on the whole happier than the citizens of totalitarian societies. And the terrible truth is that's a tough point to make at the moment when you look at the streets of America.
Mark, do you want to come in on this, or do you want me to move to the next question?
Yeah. I mean, I actually think, although I have many criticisms of Donald Trump, probably on the very narrow issue of China, if that was the only consideration that you were bringing to bear on who you wanted to be elected president, and of course it's one of many considerations, then Trump is better than Biden. And in part, to reiterate my earlier point, that is because he is remarkable owing to the flatness of the surrounding landscape. I mean, nobody else is picking up these points at all. And I agree with Damián that if Joe Biden prevails next week, that will be to some degree a reversion to normality after a period in American Western politics in general, which has been tumultuous. But I'm afraid I'm not at all confident that it will lead to a process of healing. I mean, the United States is the disunited states of America now. So it's not obvious to me that the problems that you're seeing in America and the conflict and the lack of any overlap in the Venn diagram between Republicans and Democrats is going to be resolved irrespective of who wins. So on the very, very narrow issue of China, although I have many, many criticisms of Donald Trump, I'm grateful at the moment that we have one Western leader who, as Damien rightly says, in a slightly chaotic and rather inconsistent fashion, is at least raising these issues. And I must admit, I've been disappointed in Joe Biden on this topic. In fact, I can't discern any strategy at all that he has laid out with regard to China. It's silent. And I think that does pose a threat, because my analysis would be that silence on the part of the West is exactly the problem we need to cure. At least with Donald Trump, you can be sure you will not get silence.
So let's turn to the next question from Mika Arevil. He says to me, I think I'm going to ask this to Iain first and then Steve, given it's about universities. I have for some time been concerned about the penetration of Confucius Institutes in some of our finest universities. I view them as Chinese propaganda machines, and combined with significant funding for academic exchanges and research, they represent a threat to our academic integrity. I would be keen to hear the panel's reflections on this type of academic and research collaboration. I saw you nodding furiously there, Iain. I'm going to ask you, but I'm also going to ask Steve, given he was talking about civil society and people-to-people contact. Iain, you first.
Yeah, it's interesting, this one, because I think this is the quiet, sneaky, soft power point that China understands brilliantly and has employed to great effect. Two things they know about us. Our universities are desperately, desperately, desperately searching for more money. They get a chunk off the government, but they're also keen like mad to increase their global standing. No problem with that. I fully understand the reason for that. And under normal circumstances, you would applaud that breakout from just being state-run. But the reality, I think, here is that the country that now is ready to give them as much money as they want. Look at the way Huawei said they were going to set up in Cambridge and give a lot of money to the university. And then following that very carefully, there's a lot of Chinese students come over here, a huge amount of money coming into to UK universities from Chinese students. Now, the one thing that the Chinese do not want to happen is for their students to end up imbibing the kind of defective morals of the United Kingdom. And so the Confucius Institute is clever because for two reasons. First of all, it offers money to all the universities. They've figured this one out very clearly. If you want to set a Chinese language set up in your universities, we will pay for it. So then they get to put their people in. Now, I know for a fact that this has been shown evidentially that they follow around the universities and they report back on student behavior, student activity. That's why a lot of Western students at university often say that it's very difficult to engage Chinese students. They don't seem to want to play a full part. Well, that's a huge amount to do with the fact that they're very worried about what will happen if they're seen to get involved in the kind of stuff that most students do at university. So this is a clever, soft power process, but it has a steely edge to it. And it's something which I think the Western governments, particularly the UK here, has been pathetically weak in spotting and dealing with. And we should deal with it right now. It is abhorrent to us.
Steve, you recently wrote a paper about the future of UK universities and higher education and the threat. Iain mentioned that they're desperate for money and investment, as it were. What's your view on this particular question by Miko?
Well, they're certainly highly dependent upon Chinese student income. I mean, some universities, Warwick, for example, to name a particular case, have an extraordinary proportion of their undergraduate and master's level students from China. Now, and I agree with Miko that the Confucius Institutes are basically the propaganda arm of the Chinese state. In that sense, they're no different from, say, the British Council or the Cervantes Institute, except that, as Iain says, there's this rather malevolent aspect to what they're doing, which is the way they keep an eye on students who are elsewhere. Now, the point is this, though. Half of the battle is realizing this is what you're dealing with here. So the question then is, what do you do in response? Now, I don't think the response is to simply ban any kind of contact with any Chinese students coming here, or any contact even with institutions like the Confucius Institute. That will be actually counterproductive. What you want to do is to be much more active, proactive, to use the dreadful term, in working with the Chinese students, trying to turn them, if you will, in various ways. But also, the one thing you should crack down on is the practice of reporting back to the authorities in China on what people are getting up to here. Easier said than done, perhaps, but I think that's what the real focus should be. That plus more, if you like, quite aggressive outreach to the Chinese students here. One of the things to do here would be to work with, obviously, governments like Taiwan and Singapore, where you have obviously a Chinese population, to sort of counter the view of Chinese identity that the PCP is pushing.
Thank you. Next question from, it's come from Richard Tice. And so I'm going to ask Damien this one first, and then I'm interested in Mark's view, given his classical liberal and state intervention. Richard Tice asks, do the panelists think that we should let China design and build and operate a new nuclear power station here in the UK, as is currently on the table? In addition, should greater monitoring take place at Hinkley Point C, where the Chinese state-owned CGN is a part owner and funder to ensure protection of intellectual property? Damien, what's your view on this?
Perhaps slightly counterintuitively, I'm less worried about nuclear power stations than I was about Huawei, on the grounds that the Chinese think long term. They want to build nuclear power stations around the world, and therefore, these ones are going to have to work. I don't think they're going to put anything in to sort of switch Britain off the grid or be able to threaten us on that. And by their nature, nuclear power stations are slightly binary. So you can't do odd things at the edges the way you can do with the telecoms network or broadband and so on. So although I am, as you observe, somewhere between skeptical and hostile to the Chinese state, I think that, in a sense, one of the things we want to do is to keep trading with them, keep their investment coming in when we find it useful. And so that and practical reasons, like I don't see anyone else queuing up to buy nuclear power. And I think we will need it as a non-carbon producing part of our base load for as far ahead as the eye can see. Then I am, perhaps surprisingly to people watching this, relatively relaxed about that.
Well, Mark, you're a classical liberal. You're naturally suspicious of any state intervention, whether it be the UK government or the Chinese state. Here we see a Chinese state-owned organisation as a part owner. What's your view?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I'm sceptical, and I think I've actually got more questions here for my fellow panelists than answers, Syed. And I very much take Damien's point that one might be skeptical about the Chinese in general, but perhaps nuclear power is an area to be less concerned about than them, controlling our entire internet and 5G system. But the question that arises from this, and it goes back to the previous point about universities, is what rule or framework are we going to put in place? I mean, are we going to have a list of strategic industries that we will not accept Chinese investment for example, anything that might be attached to national security, or I guess you could say poses some sort of major risk if it goes wrong deliberately or negligently, like a nuclear power station? Or do you apply this more generally, that we're concerned about Chinese investment in universities or Chinese investment, in Premier League football teams? I guess that's a form of soft power, not obviously a matter of national security. My own football team, Southampton, are 80% owned by a Chinese gentleman. I don't want to besmirch his good name. I have no reason to believe he's anything other than legitimate. But what rules and frameworks do we need to put in place? And the moment, it seems that we've got, it's a perfectly fair question from Richard Tice, but we have a kind of case-by-case approach to this. Huawei, yes or no? Nuclear power, yes or no? Universities, yes or no? And we need a strategy about what sort of investment and links we want with the Chinese and what we don't. And at the moment, I'm readily concede I'm wanting for such a strategy. I don't have one. I haven't got a blueprint here. But that's what we need. And at the moment, we're dealing with things too much on a case-by-case basis rather than strategically.
Iain, please come in. Yes.
I just want to make one point. I think we're looking down the narrow end of this question. So I think it needs to be widened up. And the truth is, I think we don't need to look at this solely from the point of security, national security. I think we need to look at this in the wider context of how do we deal with China. I would have thought the lesson we might have learned from the Huawei saga is, if over a period of time you turn a blind eye to a country that massively subsidizes its producers of goods and services to the degree that China does, then they distort the market dramatically. That was meant to be the whole point of the WTO. There's no question that they do this within the nuclear industry side of things, which is why they've undercut the Japanese in their bids on this. The UK government is going for price. So, okay, fine, you always take the cheapest price. If it works, we don't know. But my view is dependency is a critical strategic issue now in dealing with China. The more dependent we are on Chinese goods, the more companies in the West get driven to the wall because Chinese companies underbid them. You end up within each market the Huawei experience, which is there's only 3 producers of these telecom systems anywhere in the world, none in America, none in the UK, 2 in Scandinavia and 1 in South Korea. That's deliberately over the last 10 years a strategic position from China to drive them out on a price-based system. This is very much the same in every of these markets. So I would say it's not just about the control of nuclear, it's about the strategy. Are we simply going to say that we turn a blind eye to a country that breaks these rules dramatically and religiously, or are we going to say dependency is its own problem and we need to deal with that?
Going back to an earlier question about, we discussed Confucius Institute. I've put a link in the chat to a BBC story out from our very own state broadcaster, The Growth of China's Controversial Cultural Branch, if you want to read that. I know we've got just under 10 minutes left. We're going to try and let's see if I can squeeze in a couple of questions. Next question is about Taiwan, which was picked up earlier by some of our panelists. And it's from Sophia Knight, who asks, do you believe that it is our duty as a fellow democracy to support Taiwanese independence, such as by recognizing Taiwan formally and pushing for its membership in international organizations? I'm going to ask the 2 politicians here. So I'm going to ask Damián, then Iain.
Well, if you want to get through more questions, I can answer that question quite simply. Yes, I think we should.
Good. Iain?
Yes.
Very good. Steve, you are interested in international organizations. Do you have an answer on this question?
Yeah, I do think we should do that. It would make the Chinese government mad as hell, by the way. But yes, I do think we should do that.
Great. All right. Next question from Alex Lee, also about another international governmental organisation, ASEAN. Does the panel see ASEAN as having a role to play here? What would closer ties do between the UK and ASEAN, for example, an FTA post-Brexit, have on China's influence in the East? I'm going to come back to you, Damien, since you were very gracious in answering the last question quickly.
I don't think we could sign a trade deal with ASEAN as an institution. I mean, there is clearly the Trans-Pacific organisation whose acronym has simply gone out of my mind.
CPTPP.
CP, that's the one. That easy to remember thing that trips off the tongue. Yes, and it would be good for us to join that. And I mean, just generally, it would be good for us. But also, I agree that might have some effect in terms of making stronger the voice of democracy in that part of the world, and perhaps most importantly, showing other countries who are in China's near abroad, if you want to put it like that, that they have friends in Western countries that are prepared to take practical steps to work with them. So I think it's a win-win. Actually, it's good. It would be good for Britain, and it would be good for institutions in Asia that are not dominated by the Chinese Communist Party.
Interesting enough, ASEAN itself does not sign trade agreements, as you said, Damien. In fact, you saw individual countries such as Singapore and Malaysia signing trade agreements. They don't have a common trade strategy yet. I'm going to move on to the next question, if that's all right, if no one else wants to come in. And this one's from John May, and he talks about entrepreneurs. He says, my experience of doing business in China brought me into touch with many well-educated, Western-educated entrepreneurs and business people with a very capitalistic approach. In addition to which, much inward investment into China is from the huge overseas Chinese who escaped Mao. Are they all in cahoots with Xi? If not, or how much of a check and balance are they on Xi's ambitions? Mark, do you have a view on this?
Yeah, well, they don't need to be in cahoots. I think it goes back to Iain's point that, and this is uncomfortable for classical liberal economists like me, but that if everything's about money, then they're probably making rational investment decisions. That doesn't suggest a conspiracy of any sort. It's just a rate of return decision. And what we've got to be cautious about, if you care not just about prosperity and the economy, which I appreciate is the IA's principal focus, but if you care about the fundamental institutions of a free society, then not everything comes down to price. So it doesn't. My answer to John's question is no, they're not. They're not necessarily in cahoots. I mean, some could be, but the problem we face is that the very simplistic, straightforward, and I think correct starting point that trade is good, investment across borders is good, students going from one country to the other as part of their education is good. All of that is a useful starting point and a premise, but it is a rebuttable presumption. And if the consequences of going down that path are as potentially as bleak with regard to future dependencies as Iain was indicating, then we have a colossal problem. And that's why I think that we need to think very carefully about the framework. And to Alex's point about ASEAN, I mean, I think that the great challenge facing the political elites, but also all of us who care about public policy in the West, is nearly all of our international institutional frameworks are now fragile or somewhat out of date. I'm a fan of NATO, but it was obviously constructed to win the Cold War. The EU is sort of, I think, decaying at the edges. The World Trade Organization has not been successful at bringing China in. The United Nations is near as damn it a joke. It might have a useful talking shop element to it, but nothing else. Where is the great vision to set up some new international framework to bring together freedom-loving countries, which would tackle not just the issue of how to handle China, but other things as well? That is wholly and completely absent from any part of our public discourse in the West or the freedom-loving world, and I think it needs to become a part of it. I don't have a specific proposal. I'm just simply once again noting the absence of a ambitious or specific proposal.
Right, I'm going to ask you all to be very brief on the very last question. I'm being very naughty. I've only got 3 minutes left, but I'm going to ask you to give very brief answers. Robin Edwards asks, how should democracy adapt to compete? Current democracies are very inefficient. For example, the UK has not built a major new runway, during which time China has built 50 airports. I'm going to start in the order that we started with. Iain, Steve, Damien, and then Mark. Please be as brief as possible so I can get you away by the hour. Iain. Can you unmute, Iain? Sorry.
I think that democracies do face the challenge, but the reality is that the way to deal with it is not to become more autocratic, but to deal with the market rules that exist. The truth is that, yes, China can build any airport it likes because it just simply moves people. People don't have, at the base of every free democracy and market lies one very simple and important rule. Yes, we say the rule of law, but at the base of the rule of law lies the right to own property. It's actually an English concept, and the Bishop of Chartres in 1200 made that statement. And that is the key to you negotiating your life against a government, the right to own property. And that is the difference between us. And you simply have to find ways to move that better and faster, but to make it happen. But you do not turn to the idea where you lose that and then you dictate to people. That leads to autocracy.
Thank you. Our next one is Steve.
Well, 2 points. One, I think the supposed greater efficiency of the Chinese state is actually more apparent than real. There's a hell of a lot of overbuilding and white elephant creation going on there, I believe, for the kind of reasons he is talking about. Secondly, I do think that what democracies need to do is to simply make their governments smaller but more efficient, because I think what COVID has indeed shown is a serious lack of effective government capacity, simply the ability to do the kind of things that government ought to be doing effectively. And I think if you could sort that problem out, you'd be well on the way.
Damien?
First of all, hold faith in democracy. Democracy is not inherently inefficient. In the modern era, Germany is a perfectly efficiently run state and a democratic state, having arisen from ashes, basically. And also, a lot of the Chinese development has been, as it were, the equivalent of the 19th century development we saw in lots of economies here, going from absolute poverty to relative riches, which you could do quickly in a democracy in the Victorian era. But yeah, we have to address our own faults. And as I said before, we need to make not just our economies attractive, but our societies evidently attractive. That ought to be easier. It is better to live in a democracy than a totalitarian state. We just need to be better at promoting our own virtues.
And Mark?
Well, I don't disagree too much with what the other panelists have said, but I think that I'd underscore what Steve was saying, that, I mean, the UK is a very pleasant place to live in, as are other Western democracies, for political reasons, for reasons of political and social freedom, but have probably become increasingly less attractive, at least relatively, from the point of view of a rate of return. That GDP growth is sluggish, real wage growth is very poor. We show some sort of early signs of the sort of end of empire sort of fatigue that empires show in their last days, that we seem to be focused on the trivia rather than the major strategic issues of our day. So I think that in addition to retaining our belief in democracy and liberalism, which Damien rightly points out, we shouldn't say that the solution here is to become autocratic, but we need to do much, much more on economic growth. That has been pitiful, really, since the global financial crash. And I rather agree with Steve that our tendency has been to look to government to sort out these problems, build infrastructure or whatever to make the economy stronger, better, and the people of this country and the West more prosperous. And in fact, we need government to step back somewhat in order to allow the private sector to drive growth. So it's not all about prosperity, but that is a big part of the equation. And it is part of the equation that we have got badly wrong, really, over the last decade or two.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. And I hope you'll all forgive me. We've run over by a couple of minutes. I hope you'll forgive me for that. I hope so also, if you submitted a question and we didn't get round to it, I hope you'll forgive me for not being able to put your question to our panelists tonight. That just shows how popular and how interested and engaged you all were. Before I formally thank our speakers, let me first of all also thank you all for joining us as viewers. We have a regular schedule of events. Please look on our website, ia.org.uk. Tomorrow night, Mark will be in the chair instead of answering questions for Live in Littlewood at 6:30 p.m. It will be a US election special with guests from The Spectator, the ASI, The Critic, the Democracy Institute, the Free the People, and there's also Spectator. Oh, I'm muted here. For more details of all our online content, please do look at our website, ia.org.uk, our YouTube channel, IA London, or listen to our podcasts on Podbean. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Iain, Duncan Smith, Steve Davies, Damián, and also Mark Littlewood for joining us. In the meantime, before you join us for our other events, please stay safe. But thank you and have a good evening.